So anyway, to continue my summary of my brief summary of the story of an hour. Um, she goes into a room, and we are giving a kind of a glimpse into her most into her innermost thoughts, right? And we gradually, as readers, realize that she is actually not necessarily receiving the news of her husband's death in the way that we were expecting of any spouse, right? She seems to be joyful. um what she seems to be let me see, what is the word? She seems hopeful about her future and about the possibilities of a free life, that she will have from now on as a result of her husband's death. So she starts to imagine the days and the years ahead of being her own person, of not being, under anybody's influence or authority, right? Because if you contextualize this this story in the time period in which it was written, right? Then this kind of mentality, is accurate, because back then, a husband has the right to has the right to speak for his wife, right? So she is actually contemplating in her room about, her freedom, about what that may mean, right? But then she comes downstairs, and then the door opens, and in front of the door stands her non-dead husband, right? And the shock of the news and the shock of the reality of his not being dead proves too much and too sad, too overwhelming, and it crushes her. It crushes her spirit, and it destroys all of her hopes and her dreams for the future. And she dies upon the weight of that disappointment and shock, right? But of course, outwardly, right, people assumes that she dies from the shock of relief, from the shock of happiness, right? So nobody really knows in that one brief hour of her contemplated freedom, nobody really knows her true state of mind and her true feelings. So all of this unfolding of her psychological reaction, right? It's really quite ironic, and it's dramatic irony, because it's really something, it's really a secret knowledge that is known by Louise Mallard and the reader only, right? And it remains it remains impenetrable from the rest of the characters in the story. Okay, so that is the story of an hour. So let's look at some of these more specific topics. Certainly, if you look back here in this item, one of the questions is about symbolism, right? Analyze how symbolism functions in the story to reveal a greater truth about any element of the story. I think that this question is very, very relevant to the story, especially the question about how symbolism functions. Okay, because it is only through symbolism that we, as the reader, really comes to realize Louise Mallard's actual, true state of mind, as opposed to what we think how she should be feeling, which is, or how she should be feeling, which is, grief for her husband, right? But that's not actually how she feels. So symbolism and imagery that help to illustrate or hint at or symbolize Louise Mallard's true state of mind appear appears in the story when she goes to her room. This part right here. She's in her room. She is facing the window, and she sinks down into this comfortable roomy chair. Her body and her soul exhausted, but exhausted really from the weight of relief and happiness at her future prospect, not from grief as we and the rest of the characters in the story innocently think. Then she looks out the window and she sees, what does she see? She sees nature coming to life, right? She sees the treetops that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. Okay, there were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. Right, so in this brief paragraph, okay, what we see is imagery of the outside world, right? And the significance of these images of what the outside of her window looks like is that it reflects her inner soul. Okay, instead of feeling depressed and devastated at the news of her husband, right? The news of her husband's death actually brings to life all of her buried secrets and dreams that she couldn't fulfill as a woman in this time period because because society at the time, right, did not afford the opportunity or much opportunities for a woman to realize her dreams. Okay, but free from her husband, right? She has, she now has the means to do that. All right, and so these imagery are positive imagery, and they're all, every description of all the elements of the outside world as she sees through her window, the trees quivering, the delicious breath of rain was in the air, the peddler crying his wares. The peddler is living his life the way that he wants to live. He's crying out, he's unrestrained, and a breath of air, that the air smells delicious, and breathy, right? All of which denote life, right? Or things coming to life, to life. The bird is singing, and the sparrows are twittering, and the sky is blue, and all of these, right, are positive images that, like I said, denote the coming of life. And spring is usually the season, right, that's at least in literature, that symbolizes rejuvenation and freedom, right? Because after a long, cold, isolated, hibernating winter, right, spring comes, right, and allows for the flowers to bloom and allow for things to come out of its cold hiding, and to resume the activities of life, unrestrained and unafraid by the cold. All right, so this is symbolism. This is imagery that is significant in that it reflects her state of mind. It reflects her current soul, her soul in this brief hour. Okay, her soul in this brief hour. And one of the questions, let's see here. One of the specific questions that is asked for this story is, let me find it. Yes, here, the third one. The story can also be examined from a psychological standpoint in that much is revealed of Louise Mallard's innermost thoughts. What literary devices are used to convey Louise's interiority without the character's direct announcement, right? Literary devices are, of course, the symbolism and the imagery of nature outside her window, right? That speaks more loudly and more impressively to Louise's state of mind than if we were simply told by the narrator, by the third person narrator, that Louise is ecstatic, right? to use symbolism and imagery in such a way that the reader connects the imagery and symbolism to Lucy's state of mind is more impressive and more powerful. All right. So those two questions are connected. All right. So these are some of the things that you can focus on in your story. I'm sorry, in your essay if you should choose to write on this short story. Another focus or another perspective that you can take for this story in your essay is to examine the feminist, is to examine the text as a feminist text, right? Well, what does it mean? Feminism, right? This is certainly early feminist idea. Early feminist ideology is certainly underlined in this story. So you can explore this question. Kate Chopin is an important early feminist writer. In what ways is this story an example of a feminist text? Right? It certainly is a feminist text in many significant ways, but more importantly in the ways, in the themes that it explores, the themes about freedom, right? Certainly, self-ownership, right? We all want to speak for ourselves, to act for ourselves, and to be able to follow our dreams, right? So you can explore all of that, and there are other questions to consider as well. All right, so the next, I don't think I'm going to have enough time in this video, but I'm going to try to discuss Good Country briefly. If you've read chapter 20, if you've read chapter 16, then you should know that that chapter discusses how to approach, how to read and write literature in general, and the text talks about 4 general ways to get into literature and to read literature and to examine literature, and those 4 general ways are listed here. Formalist, text-centered approach, readers, rhetorical, audience-centered approach, historical, author-centered approach, and ideological approach, right? And I've organized the questions for Good Country People according to the approach that the questions seem to fall under. All right, and like I said, it is a lot. So let's just jump right into the discussions, and I'm probably gonna have to post another video to finish my discussion. I have 2 minutes left here. Okay. So before you listen to this lecture, I expect that you have already read Good Country People. If you haven't, then pause this video, come back to it at a later time after you have read Good Country People a couple of times. All right. Okay. So let's approach this in the formalist way, and let's talk about these. Let's approach it from a thematic point of view, right? This is an interesting story, right? And it's longer than the story of an hour, but it's interesting because you read it, right? And it is one of those short stories that perfectly illustrates the importance of literary analysis, right? Because literary analysis is not about summarizing what the story is about. Literary analysis is about making sense of what we've read, making sense of a story that we just read, right? And this story is so in need of that, right? Because it might strike you at first as a strange story about human connection or lack thereof, right? And after you've read it, right, some of you are probably probably thought, what the heck was that? What was I thinking in assigning you the story? Okay, so let's try to make some meaning out of that. Okay, so let's approach it by talking about the different possible themes that the story seems to explore. Some themes are, and I'll just throw it out there, and they're by no means comprehensive, but but the themes that it explores is probably about human relationships, right? It's also about outward appearance versus inward appearance. It's about identity. It's about human identity,